Imagine this for a moment. You wake up in Toronto, or maybe Vancouver. It's early 2026. Your phone lights up before your alarm does, but the notification isn't from Ottawa. It isn't about Parliament, or a policy debate, or a speech from the Prime Minister. It's from Washington. A White House statement. Another tariff threat. Another policy shift. And within minutes, the Canadian dollar slips again. 2% gone quietly, automatically, without a single vote cast in this country. You make coffee. The beans are imported. The price has crept up again because the loonie is weak and the supply chain is not Canadian. You scroll through your subscriptions, Netflix, Spotify, cloud storage, all priced in Canadian dollars, all quietly adjusting upward to match American exchange rates. You pay in loonie. They think in dollars. You leave for work. Maybe it's a tech job. Maybe it feels modern, innovative. But the logo on your laptop traces back to California. The office is Canadian. The decisions are not. Your job exists here, but your future is priced somewhere south of the border. You drive a car assembled in Ontario with an engine from Michigan, steel from Pennsylvania, software written in California, and financing tied to U.S. interest rates. At lunch, you talk about hockey. You sing "O Canada" at games. You hold a Canadian passport. Everything feels Canadian. And yet, when you trace the money, your mortgage rate, your grocery bill, your job security, your currency, the border starts to look less like a wall and more like a polite fiction. So here's the uncomfortable question this story revolves around. Is Canada actually an independent country? Or have we already, quietly and without conflict, become the economic equivalent of the 51st state? This is not a story about tanks crossing borders. It's not about flags changing overnight. In the 21st century, countries don't lose sovereignty through invasion. They lose it through integration, through dependency, through systems that slowly shift decision-making power somewhere else while preserving the illusion of choice. Canada still has elections, still has a parliament, still has laws, courts, and a national anthem. But sovereignty is not a feeling. It is not symbolism. Sovereignty is control over currency, over labor, over resources, over defense, over culture, and ultimately over the future. And when you examine those pillars closely, an unsettling pattern emerges. Canada's economy is deeply entangled with one country, the United States, in ways that go far beyond trade. Our exports, our currency, our talent pipeline, our housing market, our defense posture, our Arctic claims, our digital culture, and even our critical mineral strategy are increasingly shaped not by domestic priorities, but by American needs, American markets, and American power. This didn't happen overnight. It didn't require a conspiracy. It happened gradually, rationally, and politely, one trade agreement at a time, one capital flow at a time, one talent exodus at a time. History is full of examples like this. Empires don't always conquer. Often, they absorb. In the late 19th century, Argentina was one of the richest countries on earth, deeply tied to British capital, British shipping, and British finance. It remained sovereign on paper, but its economic fate was decided in London. When the system cracked, the illusion collapsed. In the early 20th century, much of Eastern Europe was formally independent but financially dependent currencies pegged. Industries foreign-owned, elites educated abroad. Political independence existed. Economic independence did not. Canada is not poor. Canada is not weak. Canada is not occupied, which makes this story more dangerous. Because dependency wrapped in comfort is harder to see than domination wrapped in force. This video is not anti-American. The United States is doing exactly what a superpower is supposed to do. Securing supply chains, attracting talent, protecting its interests, and leveraging its economic gravity. That's not malice. That's strategy. The real question is whether Canada has a strategy of its own, or whether we slowly allowed our economic umbilical cord to tighten so much that independence now exists mostly as branding. In this documentary, we're going to follow the money. We're going to examine why 77% of Canada's exports flow south and what that really means. Why our dollar has quietly become a pressure valve for American competitiveness. Why our best engineers, doctors, and innovators are trained here and monetized elsewhere. Why housing replaced productivity as our primary economic engine. Why our Arctic sovereignty depends on another country's military. why our culture is increasingly filtered through algorithms written in California, and why our resources, oil, minerals, and energy still leave this country raw and return expensive. This is not a story about collapse. It's a story about erosion. Slow, quiet, rational, and once you see it, it becomes impossible to unsee. Because the scariest question isn't whether Canada could become the 51st state, it's whether, economically, we already are and simply haven't updated the map yet. Let's rip the bandage off with a single number. 77%. That is the share of Canada's merchandise exports that flow directly into the United States. Not 30%, not 50%. Nearly $4 out of every 5 that Canada earns by selling physical goods depends on a single foreign buyer. In any business school on Earth, this would be labeled immediately as catastrophic concentration risk. If one client controls 77% of your revenue, that client isn't a partner. They are your employer. And employers set the terms. This level of dependency didn't happen by accident. It's the product of geography, history, and policy choices stretching back decades. The Canada-US Free Trade Agreement in 1989, NAFTA in 1994, and now USMCA all welded the two economies together. Supply chains were optimized. Factories were integrated. Borders were softened, not erased, but economically thinned. On paper, this was rational. The United States is the largest consumer market in the world. Selling to it is easy, efficient, and profitable. Why ship oil to Asia when you can pipe it south? Why build separate factories when you can integrate with Michigan and Ohio? But dependency is not measured when times are good. It reveals itself when power is exercised. In 2025, Canadians got a small preview of that reality. Trade tensions flared. The mere threat of a 10% U.S. tariff, not an actual policy, just a political signal, sent shockwaves through Canadian markets. The dollar dipped. Investment paused. Business confidence cracked. Nothing happened yet, and still, the damage was immediate. That's not a partnership. That's leverage. Now let's talk about the loonie Canada's quiet pressure valve. There was a time when the Canadian dollar stood at par with the US dollar. You could walk into an American store and feel equal. Those days are gone, and increasingly, economists doubt they'll return. By late 2025, the loonie was hovering stubbornly in the low 70-cent range. Governments often spin this as a benefit. A weaker dollar makes exports cheaper. It boosts competitiveness. But let's translate that into plain language. A weak currency doesn't mean you're better. It means you're cheaper. It means your labor costs less. Your assets cost less. Your companies become acquisition targets. Your economy shifts from innovation to discounting. You stop competing on value and start competing on price. This is how countries slide, quietly, into economic subordination. When your growth model relies on being cheaper than your neighbor, you are no longer climbing the value chain. You are positioning yourself underneath it. And this is where Canada begins to resemble something uncomfortable, a high-income version of a maquiladora economy. Same time zone, same culture, same logistics, but permanently discounted. American corporations need to offshore to Asia if Canada offers a 30% currency discount with political stability and no shipping risk. The factory stays domestic adjacent. The profits stay American. Canada becomes the northern Mexico, except colder, richer, and far more polite about it. Then comes productivity. The word politicians hate and economists fear. Productivity isn't about working harder. Canadians work plenty hard. It's about how much value each hour of work creates. And here, the gap is becoming alarming. By 2024, U.S. GDP per capita had surged nearly $20,000 ahead of Canada's. That's not a rounding error. That's a structural divergence. While the United States poured capital into AI infrastructure, advanced manufacturing, and technology platforms that scale globally, Canada doubled down on two things: resource extraction and housing. We dig things out of the ground. We sell houses to each other. We count that as growth. The problem is that productivity growth compounds. Once you fall behind, catching up becomes exponentially harder. Wages stagnate. Innovation lags. Talent looks elsewhere. And here's the cruel twist. Canada's currency is indirectly tied to American performance. Our exports depend on American demand. Our financial markets react to the Federal Reserve, but our productivity is our own responsibility, and it's falling behind. So the loonie absorbs the difference. Every year we don't innovate enough. The currency quietly devalues. Not dramatically, not in a crisis. It's just enough to keep exports competitive and wages restrained. This is how dependency hides. You don't collapse, you adjust downward. And slowly, the standard of living gap widens. The average Canadian feels this not in charts, but in life. Housing feels unreachable. Wages feel stuck. Groceries feel expensive. Debt feels heavier. And the future feels smaller than the one their parents had. Meanwhile, American firms grow larger, richer, more productive, and increasingly dominant inside Canada itself. At this point, it's worth asking the question historians often ask in hindsight. At what moment does integration become subordination? When your largest trading partner can destabilize your currency with a speech. When your economic model relies on staying cheaper than them. When your productivity gap widens every year. When your exports, wages, and growth orbit a foreign center of gravity. Is that independence, or is it something softer, quieter, and more dangerous? Because countries don't lose sovereignty when they're conquered. They lose it when they optimize themselves into dependence and then discover there's no easy way back. And this is only the first chord. Next, we have to follow the people. Because the most valuable export Canada sends south isn't oil, lumber, or cars. It's brains. If you want to see the future of Canada's economy, don't look at the Toronto Stock Exchange. Look at a graduation ceremony. Specifically, look at the University of Waterloo, one of the most important technology pipelines in the country. Every year, thousands of highly trained engineers, computer scientists, and mathematicians cross that stage. Their education was subsidized, their research funded, their skills sharpened by a system designed, at least in theory, to build Canada's future. Now watch where they go. At the back of the room, recruiters wait. And most of the logos don't belong to Canadian firms. They belong to American ones. Google, Meta, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, startups funded by Silicon Valley venture capital. Defense contractors, AI labs. Among students, there's a phrase that says everything. Collie or bust. This isn't just ambition, it's arithmetic. Imagine you're 24 years old. You land a software engineering offer in Toronto for $90,000 Canadian. That's objectively a strong salary. Then reality sets in. A one-bedroom apartment in downtown Toronto costs $2,600 a month. Home ownership is a fantasy. Taxes bite. Student loans linger. You run the numbers and realize you're working hard just to stand still. Then you look south. Seattle, Austin, San Francisco. Suddenly, the border isn't a line on a map. It's a paywall. By staying in Canada, you're not just choosing patriotism. You're accepting an implicit penalty, often close to $100,000 a year in lost earning potential. Over a decade, that's $1 million. Over a career, it's generational wealth. And people respond rationally. In some years, estimates suggest that up to 80% of top engineering graduates from elite Canadian programs leave for the United States shortly after graduation. Canada pays the education bill. America collects the productivity. This isn't just tech. Canada is bleeding doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals as well. At the exact moment when family doctor shortages reach crisis levels, when millions of Canadians can't find primary care, Canadian-trained physicians quietly take licensing exams in Michigan, New York, and California. Why? Because working conditions are often better, pay is higher, bureaucracy is lighter. And for top earners, American healthcare isn't a risk, it's a benefit. Employer plans are fast, specialist access is immediate. Waiting 2 years for an MRI isn't part of the deal. Canada absorbs the cost of childhood education, subsidized universities, and early career healthcare. Then, right when these individuals become economically productive, when they start paying high taxes, building companies, mentoring others, they leave. The United States gets a finished product at zero cost. Canada gets the bill. This is not an accident. It's a model. Canada has quietly become a human capital exporter, a country that trains world-class talent and then watches it integrate into another economy. It's the same pattern we see in developing nations, except here, it's happening under the cover of affluence. Defenders of the system often retreat to a familiar argument. At least we have universal health care, and for many people, that matters deeply. It's a moral achievement. But here's the uncomfortable truth. For the top 10% of earners, the very group Canada is losing. American employer-provided healthcare is often superior in speed and access. If you're earning $250,000 in Texas, you're not worried about bankruptcy from a broken leg. You're worried about why your friends back in Toronto are stuck on wait lists, so the trade-off becomes brutal. Canada offers moral comfort. America offers momentum, and people choose momentum. Over time, this drains more than just talent. It drains ambition. It drains risk-taking. It drains the critical mass needed to build global companies domestically. Because innovation clusters don't form where people leave, they form where people stay. The result is a vicious loop. Lower productivity leads to weaker currency. Weaker currency makes wages less competitive. Less competitive wages accelerate brain drain. Brain drain further weakens productivity. Round and round it goes. And while the headlines argue about identity and values, the most important economic transaction of all keeps happening quietly. Canada exports its future, one graduate at a time. If sovereignty is the ability to shape your own destiny, then a country that cannot retain its most capable citizens is already in trouble. But the model doesn't stop with people. Next, we have to talk about land. Because in Canada, land stopped being a place to live and became the economy itself. If you want to understand how a country loses sovereignty without losing its flag, stop looking at Parliament Hill. Start by looking at a rotting bungalow. The kind with outdated wiring, peeling paint, and a cracked driveway. The kind your grandparents might have bought on a single income. In much of Canada, that house now sells for $1.4 million. Not because it produces value. Not because it houses innovation, but because we decided, collectively, that housing would replace productivity as the engine of national wealth. There, as an old joke economists tell about Canada, it is not a country with an economy. It is a real estate bubble with a flag. The joke lands because it's too close to the truth. In most developed economies, housing supports the economy. It provides stability so workers can build things elsewhere. In Canada, housing is the economy. At its peak, residential investment as a share of GDP was nearly double that of the United States. Capital that should have gone into research, manufacturing, and new companies was instead poured into bidding wars over square footage. This didn't just distort prices, it distorted power. When your economy depends on asset inflation, you lose policy freedom. The Bank of Canada cannot cut rates to stimulate growth without reigniting the housing inferno. It cannot raise rates to control inflation without risking a financial collapse. Every decision becomes defensive, not strategic, not visionary, merely about keeping the bubble alive one more year. That is not sovereignty. That is hostage management, and the debt beneath it is staggering. Canadian households now carry some of the highest debt loads in the developed world, roughly $185 owed for every dollar of disposable income earned. This makes the entire population fragile. One recession, one spike in unemployment, one housing correction, and the system cracks. When that happens, Ottawa won't be able to rescue it alone. Mortgage insurance, bank stability, and emergency liquidity would almost certainly require coordination with, or direct support from, U.S.-dominated financial institutions. When your housing market needs foreign backstopping to survive, your independence has already been compromised. Meanwhile, ownership itself is changing. Homes are increasingly bought not by families, but by corporate entities, real estate investment trusts, pension-backed funds, private equity firms. Many are global. Many are American. Canadians are transitioning from owners to tenants, paying rent to entities headquartered in New York or London. When you rent the land you live on from foreign capital, work for foreign firms, and consume foreign media, what exactly remains domestic? This erosion extends beyond suburbs and balance sheets. It reaches into the Arctic. Canada's north looks vast, empty, and eternal. But geopolitically, it is becoming one of the most contested regions on Earth. As ice melts, the Northwest Passage opens a future shipping route that could reshape global trade. Canada claims it as internal waters. Much of the world disagrees, including the United States. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Canada lacks the capacity to enforce its claim. For decades, Canadian defense policy could be summarized in 3 words. Call the Americans. We underspend on defense. We struggle with recruitment. Our procurement cycles collapse under their own bureaucracy. Our Arctic capabilities remain thin. If a foreign power sails through the Northwest Passage tomorrow under the claim of international transit, Canada can protest. It can send a patrol. But escalation would bring one actor decisively into play: the U.S. Navy. And if Washington shows up, it won't be to defend Canadian sovereignty. It will be to secure North American security on American terms. This is how protectorates form, not through conquest, but through reliance. When you cannot defend your borders without another country's military, control quietly shifts. The locks change. The keys move south. Add to this the digital sphere. Canadian culture once protected itself through regulation. Canadian content rules ensured domestic voices had space to breathe. The internet erased those walls overnight. Algorithms optimized for engagement don't care about nationality. They reward scale. And scale is American. Canadian creators quickly learn the lesson. Sound American or stay small. Talk about dollars, not loonies. Say the city, not Toronto. Cover U.S. politics. Imports U.S. culture wars. The algorithm punishes specificity and rewards assimilation. Even news became fragile. When Canada tried to force tech giants to pay for journalism, platforms didn't negotiate. They erased the news. Overnight, during wildfire evacuations, people couldn't even share emergency updates. When your information ecosystem is controlled externally, culture becomes a byproduct, not a choice. And finally, we reach the ground beneath it all. Resources? Canada has lived this story before. We dig, we cut. We export raw. Others refine. Others profit. It was fur, then timber, then oil. Now it's lithium, cobalt, nickel, the minerals of the green transition. Once again, the pattern repeats. American capital funds extraction. American factories capture value. Canada supplies the raw input. Friendshoring, they call it. Strategic integration. But history has another name for it: dependency. So, here we are. A country with wealth, talent, land, and institutions slowly optimized to serve someone else's system. Not conquered, not collapsed, just absorbed. Which brings us to the final question. Is this the end of the story, or the last moment before choice disappears entirely? So let's return to where this story began. It's 2026. You're holding a Canadian passport. You're standing on Canadian soil. You vote in Canadian elections. You sing a Canadian anthem. On paper, nothing has changed. And yet, almost everything that determines your economic life now originates somewhere else. Your interest rates follow the U.S. Federal Reserve. Your currency absorbs America's productivity gap. Your job prospects depend on U.S. corporations. Your best talent builds another country's future. Your housing market relies on global capital. Your Arctic security depends on American force. Your culture is filtered through Californian code. Your resources flow south, raw, discounted, dependent. This is not how empires expand in the 21st century. There are no declarations, no invasions, no parades. Nations don't vanish with a bang anymore. They fade with a whisper through convenience, complacency, and quiet alignment. Canada is not the 51st state in name. There is no formal annexation, no legal merger, no flag swap. But functionally, we are integrating by osmosis. We have outsourced our defense to the Pentagon, our economic pulse to the Federal Reserve, our culture to Silicon Valley, and our growth strategy to American demand. We remain polite, prosperous, and stable while slowly hollowing out the machinery that makes independence real. And this is the hardest part to accept. The United States is not doing anything wrong. This is what superpowers do. They attract talent. They secure supply chains. They shape systems in their favor. They absorb value. They act in their own interest. The responsibility does not lie in Washington. It lies in Ottawa. Sovereignty is not a permanent condition. It is a muscle. And muscles atrophy when they aren't used. Canada stopped exercising its economic muscle. We chose housing over productivity, politeness over strategy, stability over ambition. We assumed geography would protect us and goodwill would last forever. History suggests otherwise. But here's the part that still matters. This story is not finished. Canada still has what most countries would kill for: world-class institutions, a highly educated population, enormous resource wealth, political stability, social trust, proximity to the largest market on Earth. Dependency is not destiny, but reversing it requires discomfort. It requires building industries instead of bubbles, retaining talent instead of exporting it, processing resources instead of shipping them raw, funding defense instead of outsourcing it, protecting culture instead of surrendering it to algorithms, and, most importantly, deciding that independence is worth paying for, because independence always costs something. The question is whether Canadians are willing to pay that cost, or whether we prefer the quiet comfort of becoming a state in everything but name, a nice place to live, a reliable supplier, a stable neighbor, but not a serious country. So what do you think? Are we already too far gone? Are you thinking about moving south or staying to fight for a sovereign future? Is Canada still independent or just politely dependent? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if you want to understand how housing swallowed the Canadian economy, that story is waiting for you next. Thanks for watching.